Our next speaker is Mr. Ancheta. He's a current Citizens Redistricting Commissioner. He's an attorney who is focused on civil rights laws, constitutional rights, appellate advocacy, and nonprofit management. He's taught at UCLA, Harvard, NYU, and Santa Clara University. Mr. Ancheta is a legal services attorney and nonprofit executive director specializing in immigrants' rights and voting rights. He holds a bachelor's degree and a law degree from UCLA, as well as a master's degrees from Harvard Kennedy School of Government and Claremont Graduate University. Thank you, Mr. Ancheta.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, everybody. So I'm actually the vice chair of the commission currently, and I think on behalf of the commission, I want to congratulate you on your becoming members of the panel, and thank you ahead of time for all the hard work. You've got a lot to do over the next several months, and it's a challenge for you. We'll talk about some of the challenges and what I'm going to talk about, but ideally you will have more than a fair share and abundance of talent to work with. And the hard part will actually be trying to figure out how to get down to that 60 that you have to produce at the end of the day. So we're very excited that you're engaged in this process. If there's anything we can do to help, obviously you want to maintain your independence, your impartiality, but any of us as individuals or collective will be glad to help the auditor's office and you in particular, as needed. Now, having said that, what I'm going to talk about today is not officially commission positions. I'm going to give you suggestions, opinions, recommendations, personal observations. Certainly, a lot of things that I'll talk about would be shared by many, if not all, of the commissioners. But I'll say a few things that, they're just my opinions, okay? And you can take them as opinions, and if you think they're constructive, they might be helpful, use them. If not, feel free to discard them. So, I'm talking about diversity in communities of interest today, just as an overview. And a lot of this will be reviewed because ideally you've already been looking at some of the regulations and the criteria. So I'll move quickly through that, but I want to talk about diversity, the criterion, the appreciation for California's diverse geography and demography. I'll talk specifically about communities of interest, which is tied into diversity, but it's a very important concept within the redistricting criteria and is particularly important because it drove a lot of the Commission's activities and resources in terms of public input. And then throughout, I'll be talking about how did we actually implement this and how does your selection process, your review of applications tie in with what you would like to see in the commissioners. Okay. So again, this should be familiar to you. The Constitution for California says that the process has to be independent and you're supposed to produce a commission that is reasonably representative of the state's diversity. Okay, reasonably. It is difficult, if not impossible, to have a representative body within 14 people. Certainly not even 60 people or 120 people as you're narrowing it down. You must try, of course, to look at all these different factors, demographic, geographic as well. Try to apply the criteria appropriately, but you're never going to get full representativeness. It's impossible to really get that within a small number of people. There's a definition in the regulations: racial, ethnic, geographic, economic, and gender characteristics. Okay, gender is evolving, right? You're now tracking non-binary individuals within the statistics. That's not something you did 10 years ago. How does that play into the diversity of the pool, applications? Something to think about. You're supposed to consider it in multiple stages of the process, that the application process is reflective of the state's diversity, the composition of the pool. However, you are not supposed to use formulas or specific ratios. So there's no quotas here. You're not striving for proportional representation, which doesn't mean you shouldn't be attentive to the numbers, but you're not looking at specific formulas or ratios. Okay, so you have three main criteria, and we've covered this before. So analytical skills, ability to be impartial, And then the one I'm going to focus on, appreciation for California's diverse demographics and geography. They're all related. Okay, if you have an appreciation for that diversity, you shouldn't be biased against particular groups or individuals. If you're trying to figure out how the population and the redistricting lines ought to be drawn, you will apply analytical skills. You'll apply strategies to maintain that diversity and address differences among populations. So they're related, obviously. What does that mean? What's that term? Lengthy definition. You have to look at the fact that demographics often drives political preferences in terms of representation, which includes, this is not exclusive, it includes race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. That wasn't in the previous definition of diversity, so it's something different. And then economic status, but those are examples. And then you have geographic characteristics: urban, suburban, rural, industrial, agricultural, coastal, inland, arid, temperate. Very diverse state. And the third element is that you have to recognize the fact that not everybody has been able to participate fully in the electoral process. And it's no coincidence that this language is parallel to language in the Federal Voting Rights Act. Okay, remember that the VRA is a second level, a very highly ranked criterion for the commission. Commissioners have to understand its importance, and that language is drawn directly from the language of the Voting Rights Act. And then you get several examples. These are non-exclusive. You will expect applicants to talk about that appreciation. You'll expect them to list experiences. A couple of examples: working on projects where you deal with different populations, ideally achieving consensus. There's an example about studying voting behavior. That's not a common thing, but it is an indication that you are looking at diverse behaviors within the state. It could be something like marketing, could be sales, something similar to voting behavior, but looking at how differences exist. Traveling throughout the state, working with people, that's sort of obvious. It doesn't have to be that you travel, you're not traveling as part of your job, and maybe simply be, well, you spend time in different parts of the state at different times of the year. That's a good, that gives you a good sense of someone's appreciation. It's not the only thing, but it's important. Okay, so if you put these two together, you have a couple of tasks. One is you have to look at things in the aggregate, right? So you have to look at those statistics to see how your pool has been evolving, where there might be disparities. This is important to say, well, the gender balance ought to, it's approximately 50-50. If it's 48-52 or, 48-51, including the non-binary population, that's not way out of whack. If it ends up being 80-20, one gender versus another, that tells you something. Is there something creeping into your process where the aggregate numbers are revealing something going on, whether it's conscious or unconscious? And of course, you have to look at each application, right? Is there an appreciation within each applicant's file for the diversity of the state? Okay. But one of the challenging things for you is that you have to go through all these different applications. You may or may not be thinking each time, well, how does this figuring into the diversity criteria, or diversity of the state and how it ties in with our pool? Am I supposed to be thinking, well, this candidate is a minority candidate, or this candidate is from Northern California, or this candidate has a particular geographic tie that is not necessarily that well represented within the larger pool. You should be thinking about that as you're going through individual applications, but you're not necessarily going to get that flavor until you look at the aggregate statistics. So you've got to think about all that's going on at the same time. And the thing to be careful about, and this is something that if you talk to folks who do HR, if you think about the analog between what you're doing and, say, college admissions, you have to look at where might bias creep in. Okay, so let me give you an example. If you were looking at applicants who have a lot of experience, so a lot of employment experience, a lot of managerial experience, let's say, to think about how they're going to manage an agency, you're going to maybe end up with a skew that's a little bit older. Okay, somebody who's had 20 years experience might be more favorable to you than somebody who's had, say, 5 years experience. Now, what does that mean? Well, you might end up with some 40, 50, 60-year-old top applicants, and you might lose a few 30 or mid-20. You can't be too young because of the criteria or the eligibility criteria, but you might skew a bit on the higher end. That doesn't mean you shouldn't look at experience, but that's something that might creep into the statistics. If you value higher education, if you say, well, wow, this person has a master's degree, or this person has a PhD, and it's in geography or urban planning, does that skew in some way the outcome when you put it in the aggregate? Does having a lot of people with masters or PhDs lead you down a path where, well, it seems to be a little more white or more male than one might want in terms of overall demographics? Something to think about, which isn't to say that PhDs and folks with masters aren't very good candidates, but it's something that might creep in as a bias, okay? Be a bit introspective yourself. Do I have any particular, it's hard to think about unconscious bias because it's unconscious, right? But, are there things where I work in Sacramento. Do I have a bias for or against folks from the local area? I don't know. It's something for you to think about in terms of your own backgrounds. Okay, so I don't want to talk about, though I'm happy to answer questions, I don't want to talk about what's happening with the current pool. It's your job to figure out how you're doing with the current pool. But I did want to look at what happened in 2010, some of the numbers there, as well as the current CRC. Okay, so these are stats from the auditor's office, and these are the breakdown of the 60 top applicants. Remember, of course, that there are legislative strikes, there'll be a lottery system. This is as far as you actually go in terms of narrowing the pool. So if you look at the numbers, it's pretty diverse racially. It's actually majority-minority in terms of numbers. And that's actually the composition of the current commission. It's majority-minority. There's a little bit of skew when you look at subpools. You're not necessarily having to have, you're looking at the aggregate numbers. So you don't have to necessarily look at subpools. Ideally, these numbers would kind of be uniform or similar across the pools. You may or may not get that. That is noticeable if you look at gender. If you look at the Republican numbers, it's skewed male, 70% male, 30% female. But if you look at the Democrats, it's 65% female, 35% male. I can't tell you what happened there. Obviously, the panel made certain decisions. They acted unanimously in terms of their selection process, but you have a bit of a differentiation there. But you end up, at the end of the day, at something close to 50-50. Party breakdown, the interesting part is in the other category where you look at who actually is in the, it's now called no party preference, not declined to state, but you had 2 Green Party members, one other, I can't remember, there might have been American Independent, I can't quite remember what the other party was. And the majority of them were, at the time, what we'll call declined to state. All of the other commissioners on the current commission are declined to state, no party preference. Okay, geographic data, clearly you've lost a lot of counties. Okay, so 58 counties in the state, a little bit over 20 counties here, around 20 counties. You don't have necessarily representation that reflects the population of those counties. So LA County, the largest one, close to 10 million people at the time, 20%. It probably should have been higher, but that's where it ended up. San Francisco, 10%. That's high compared to the population, which is about 750, 800,000 people in the state. Now, again, that's general population, not the applicant pool or the eligible voters. But it's noticeable, and that's something that's reflected on the commission in terms of having a lot of Bay Area people. But if you talk about a lot of the state, a lot of Northern California counties, northern, they're not in the mix here. Okay, and again, some regional breakdowns. You're following the same sort of breakdowns this time around. Again, Bay Area, pretty high percentage, 35%. Southern Coastal, which is LA, Orange, and San Diego counties, high, close to 30%, but might expect something higher. Okay. Again, bottom line is you have to let the process go forward as you do it every day and as you're tracking. If you end up short on some numbers, you have to feel comfortable that, well, we did our best. We looked at applicants fairly, and we were attentive to diversity, and this is where we ended up. But I think it's a good pool. It's a very good pool. And I don't know everybody in there. I didn't listen to all the interviews. Great people in that bunch. Oh, one more. Economic status. Now, remember, economic status here is a snapshot. Okay, you're asked for current income level. People's income levels vary over a lifetime. Most people tends to go up. Some kind of fluctuates a little bit. This is an important area where there's a skew on the higher end. And again, that may be tied to education level, might be tied to level of experience. You just don't have that many people at the lower end. Okay, but again, it's a snapshot. Somebody might be a business owner who's done very well, but this last year, just couldn't pull it in. They're at the lower end, right? I was in the 125 to 250. That's not how I was most of my career. Okay, I was lower than that. I just was a legal aid lawyer for most of my career. I became an academic, it went up quite a bit. Okay, that's just the nature of what was happening at the time. Okay, so this is the current group. This table is drawn from a report by the League of Women Voters, which I would commend you to take a look at. It's a fairly lengthy report, but it's a very thorough analysis and a third-party analysis of the Commission's work. But it's a nice table in terms of some of the characteristics of the Commission. So, there are a lot of lawyers. There's 4 lawyers, or at least 4 people with law degrees. Only one of them is actually practicing. High education levels. I don't think anybody has less than a master's or a doctorate. Is that good or bad? I don't know. It helped, but you don't need a master's. I don't necessarily think you need a bachelor to do this. But that's who we ended up with. A fairly good distribution across the state, but no representation north of the Sacramento area. Okay, so that's something to think about. Gender breakdown, roughly equal. I think it's 8 to 6. It was originally 7 to 7. If you go to the bottom where I am, you'll notice that I'm an other because I was a replacement commissioner. Okay, one of the commissioners stepped down. One of the random draw commissioners stepped down pretty early in the process, and I was picked to replace her. And I'll talk about that a little more detail because it tells you how the commission looked at diversity when it was picking people to be on the commission. Okay. Okay, so how does this work in actual work of the commission? Okay, it is everywhere in the commission's work. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first 8 commissioners have to pick the remaining 6. Okay, it is certainly conceivable. It's unlikely, but it's certainly conceivable that in a random process, you end up with a lot of skews. Okay, you could, theoretically end up with an all-male set of 8, or everybody is from Northern California, or everybody is a lawyer, just out of random selection. Okay, the first 8 commissioners had to pick the remaining 6. And if you look at some of the hearings, the transcripts, a lot of debate back and forth. Like, well, what's better? Do we need to look at geography? Do we need to look at gender? Do we need to look at race, ethnicity? All of those things came into play. And I didn't make that cut the first time around. And it had to do with some of the diversity because I didn't make the random draw. That's just luck. And by the way, the commissioners sort of self-developed their own sort of nicknames. The first 8 had been called the Lucky Ones, and then the rest were called the Chosen Ones. It's been in the news lately, that phrase. I don't want to talk any more about that, but that was the nickname. That was a nickname that kind of came up over time. But I didn't make either of those cuts, okay? And for good reason, okay? Because if you look at the breakdown of who was in the random draw, there was a commissioner already from San Francisco who was a Democrat, who was Asian American. There were plenty of lawyers. Some folks had a lot of experience with a couple people had some experience with the Voting Rights Act and a little bit of experience with redistricting. So if you look at the mix and you're trying to fill the holes in the mix, you go somewhere else. Now, they talked about me a little bit, and I fully understand, I expected not to get picked, because you look at the rest of the pool and go, well, we need to fill the holes here, okay? And that's what happened. Now, I was looked at again because one of the commissioners stepped down, and there was a bit of a back and forth because there were 2 of us ultimately who got into sort of the final selection process, and they took multiple votes. And ultimately they went with me, and not necessarily for diversity reasons. Okay, so if you look who was going into it, there were 7 people altogether, 1 male, 6 female. One candidate in particular came from the San Luis Obispo area, very good background, had done a lot of local government work, a lot of marketing, would have made a fine commissioner. I thought she was just going to get it. I didn't even pay much attention to it. I went to go teach a class during the hearing. I was watching on the web. I came back and went, oh, I think they're talking about me, right? What happened? Well, they looked at what they needed. They said, well, he has some experience with redistricting. I'd done some work in the 90s. He looks at the VRA a lot. He studies it. He's worked on it. He's wrote about it, written about it. He has some experience working with rural organizations. That's a good skill set. Maybe that'll help us in terms of filling the gaps that we're getting overall. So that's how I got on the commission. So they're looking at all those different things. But it wasn't purely on, say, geography or demographics. Okay, how else? Hiring and managing staff, consultants, public education and outreach strategies. Where do you go to tell people, testify, give us information? In particular, how do you look with might be called underrepresented or underserved communities, immigrant communities, media, non-English language media? Where do you do hearings? Okay, this is a big question for the commissioners. How many hearings do you do? Where do you do it? What parts of the state? Where are you probably going to miss some information? How do you get it into the commission? How does the public testimony inform the line drawing? How do you take that in? All these different people, all these different parts of the state, what's missing? Okay, where are you missing information? Where have you not gotten testimony? That requires an understanding and appreciation of the diversity of the state. And ultimately, the actual line drawing. What's important? Where are the communities of interest? Where are the neighborhoods? What are we putting together in a single district that represents or provides an accurate and fair set of boundaries that are representative of the folks who live in that district? Okay, so it's all over the place in terms of the work. Okay. Let me pause right here because I'm going to move on to communities of interest. Any questions at this point?
Did the panel members have any questions?
No questions. Okay.
No questions right now.
Okay. Okay, communities of interest. You've talked about this in previous sessions. Justin Levin covered it. I think Karen McDonald also covered it. It's one of the criteria. It's the 4th level. And the commissioners are supposed to maintain the integrity of cities, counties, city and county, which is San Francisco is the only one of those, local neighborhoods or local communities of interest. Okay, so again, within the rankings, federal constitutional requirements, 1 person, 1 vote, mandates, then the Voting Rights Act, then contiguity, then the 4th level criteria, cities, counties, neighborhoods, communities of interest, and those are supposed to outrank compactness and nesting. And within the fourth level, everything's equal. Okay, so cities and counties, neighborhoods and local neighborhoods, local communities of interest are all the same. Okay, so what's a community of interest? A contiguous population where there are shared commonalities with social and economic interests that should be kept within the district. Okay, and examples, and this is similar to language around diversity. Urban areas, rural areas, industrial areas, agricultural areas, where people have similar living standards, they use the same transportation, work opportunities, media, et cetera. And these are just examples, right? So, and communities of interest do not include, and this is one of several prohibitions on these topics, which are parties, incumbents, and candidates. Okay. So there's some clear parallels, right? So urban, rural, industrial, those are mentioned in the diversity language as well as community of interest. Sometimes we use the term COI, but community of interest. Some of them are similar in terms of economic status, living standards, work opportunities. Not mentioned among the examples, but clearly ones that come up. Race and ethnicity, sexual orientation certainly came up within the commission's process. And then other things which aren't really diversity factors, but they're meaningful. So having access to similar transportation or having common media markets. Okay. Now, communities of interest are very challenging. And I would argue that they're probably the single most important driver of, or at least were in our case, the single most important driver of the Commission's strategies and resources around public input. Okay, nothing drove the agenda in terms of education, outreach, hearings, various forms of communication with the Commission as much as communities of interest. So it's an important point. At the same time, it is probably the least defined, the vaguest, perhaps the most open-ended criterion that you see, and it's one that can get the Commission in trouble if they don't handle it properly. I think we did a good job. I'm not sure if it was a complete job. We probably could have done better if we'd had more time, but it is really important, which is why we're covering it today. So, unlike cities and counties and some neighborhoods in some major cities, you don't have well-bounded communities of interest, typically. You don't know exactly where the lines are drawn. You don't know where the northern part is, the southern part is. The people may tell you this, but you don't know just a priori what a community interest boundaries are. Okay. The conceptions among the public, and even if you talk to different commissioners, you'll get a little bit of a different opinion. That can vary quite a bit, and it's often very subjective in terms of what ought to be a community or what's an interest, and how does that all tie together in terms of representation within the district. Now, it's supposed to fit. A community of interest is supposed to fit within a district, or maybe a couple districts if it's a large one, and you may have to split it. But if you look at a lot of our testimony and a lot of the discussion of the Commission itself, some of these communities, as defined by members of the public, were gigantic. Okay, you couldn't fit them all within a district. So if you talk about the coastal interest, well, how long is the California coast, right? Or if you talk about the foothills, the Sierra Nevada was talked about as a commonality in terms of foothill interest. The San Gabriel Mountains in Southern California. But those stretch on for miles and miles. So how do you, they may in fact be important commonalities, but how do you actually narrow that down to an actual district or just a couple districts? Not easy. Communities of interest can overlap, and they may be in conflict. Okay, you say, well, here's a Latino community over here, and right in the middle of part of it is also an Asian community. Well, which one are we supposed to look at as protecting? The Latino one, the Asian one? Should we put them together? we face some of those challenges. Okay, a couple more points. You can't get all the testimony that you'd like. Plenty of gaps in terms of community of interest testimony. It's not always consistent. Can be conflicting. Here's an important point. It can be manipulated. We don't want to, imply good or necessarily suggest bad faith on the part of the public. We want to assume that it is sincere and accurate. But I can give you examples where it wasn't entirely clear that these were people they were actually speaking for. Okay, we got a lot of sort of quote-unquote front organizations that probably represented partisan interests. But you don't know in any individual case, particularly when it's an individual, where there might be something else going on. Is this actually a Democrat or a Republican who's trying to protect an incumbent? You don't know. And your auditors, you're kind of trained to think of it. Well, how do we kind of tease a lot of that out? That's something the commission has to do ultimately, but it is a tricky problem because you want to be able to trust the information you're getting, but it might be, again, for something that's actually not allowed under law. Okay. Last point, huge amount of testimony. Okay, the commission conducted over 30 hearings. 20, I think it's over 2,700 people testified, over 20,000 written comments and maps, lot of information, and the commission invited that, right? We said, give us information. And in my opinion, I think we did as best as we could, but it was a lot of information, and I don't know that I know we could have done it better, right, in terms of trying to figure out all of these different inconsistencies, filling in the gaps, and trying to figure out which ones were the priorities. So that will be an ongoing problem, particularly if the next commission maintains that high volume of hearings and keeps written comments, or maximizes written comments. Okay, so I want to mention something because I think Justin Levitt talked about this a couple of days ago. It wasn't an issue for our commission because we basically just said we're going to rely on public testimony, okay, oral and written testimony. We're not going to look at demographic data or statistical data, and we just ran out of time too in terms of trying to get somebody to actually do that kind of analysis. This has been a topic of discussion among a lot of professionals, a lot of academics. It's something I suspect will come up for the next commission because there are going to be a lot more calls for computer-generated computational techniques, different kinds of ways of, and this is because of a lot of advances in terms of computing power and artificial intelligence. You don't need to know all the nitty-gritty about this stuff, but the commission is going to encounter this. Okay, so you have to look at people who actually will at least feel comfortable looking at this kind of stuff. They don't have to know how to do it themselves, but they need to feel comfortable, because I think it's going to come out. So there is the public input approach, which is to take a lot of the testimony and try to pull it all together and synthesize it. And there are approaches which I'm just calling statistical analyses. So advantages, you have public engagement in terms of public input. You can get a lot of insights in terms of non-obvious areas. Vince talked about the Sikh and Hmong communities up in Northern California. I knew a lot of those communities were there. I don't know exactly where they were, and for Vince, it was sort of a revelation. He just didn't know about it, and that's great. It can help promote agreement and consensus. Not always, but it can promote agreement among the commissioners, and it gives you a base to say, here's why we are drawing these lines. We have community of interest testimony. Okay, again, disadvantages I've talked about. It's kind of open-ended. There's only some examples. There could be a lot of different kinds of interests. There's gaps, there's conflicts. I'm calling it a big data problem because it's a lot to absorb. Okay, it's a lot of information. And it could lead to cherry picking. So you might remember, I remember that person talked about this community of interest. Well, memory might be failing you a bit because you forgot about those 20 other people who talked about that different community of interest. Okay? Not to point the finger at anybody, but that can happen in a normal process. And some of that's just due to memory failure or selective memory. Okay, statistical stuff. This has mostly been in the academic sector, but I suspect it will come out in testimony, and the commissioners themselves may want to think about this. I don't know if they do. If you talk to Karen McDonald, who you heard from a couple of days ago, she doesn't like this stuff, okay? And that's okay. She's part of the debate. She's written about the importance of public testimony. But there are other professionals, other academics who talk about things like using what are called factor analyses, cluster analyses, looking at political data like ballot initiative patterns, which don't necessarily connect to partisan or incumbent-based patterns. So you might be able to sort of separate what are prohibited categories from what might be revealing. Because if you look at particular types of initiatives and who voted for them, that might tell you, well, there's something these folks have in common, right? So the advantages, well, you have some standards. They're statistical. They may be consistent across the whole state. If you apply it similarly, you can end up with the entire state being figured out. But you can miss a lot of things. Your methodology may be flawed. You don't necessarily get all the real complexities and conflicts that you might get out in a public input process. And it's going to cost you money because you don't want to rely just on some external testimony from an expert who's done the analysis. You want to keep that in-house. You want to look at a consultant or a staff member, right? Now, and this is my opinion, because this is my opinion. I think you can do both. You have to rely on public input. That's got to be the primary driver, and it's required by statute. You have to get a lot of public input, and it's an important part of the process. But you can look at other kinds of things like census data, I think, because it helps fill the gaps. Okay, because there's plenty of parts of the state you don't get any testimony from. You're going to get inconsistencies. How can you reconcile some of those? And this final point is important. It's judgment. This is the human factor, okay? You can't just throw it into a computer and have it spit it out. You can, and they could be pretty good maps, and they could, in fact, be legal maps. But this whole process is about people making decisions and exercising judgment. Okay, what's the best way to do this? What's fair? What's right? And how, given all these criteria, do we put everything together? And sometimes you have to make a call, right? You don't want to just sort of toss a coin up in the air, but somebody has to make a decision. Right? That's why you need good people who can make wise and smart decisions. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about communities of interest that might be based on race or ethnicity, because that will come up, and it's tied in with some of the diversity criteria. Very common, you'll hear it from, there will be advocacy groups who are doing civil rights work. That's an important part of the process as well. They come up a lot, okay? Now, you had some exposure to the Voting Rights Act and majority-minority districts. It's important to note that these kinds of communities of interest differ from what might be considered majority-minority districts under the Voting Rights Act. The standards for the VRA, and there's a major court case and a line of cases interpreting how the VRA ought to be applied and how many people are in the majority and what the percentages are, but those don't apply to communities of interest. Okay, so you can have populations that are less than 50% of the citizen voting age population. You don't have to have evidence of racially polarized voting. Okay, the VRA is a little bit different from a lot of anti-discrimination laws because it's very specific in terms of who is protected, and there are groups that aren't clearly protected by the VRA. So if you say there's let's say a European American or an immigrant group that might need protection, or a larger group, let's say Arab Americans, their protection under the VRA is not there, or it's at least ambiguous. But there are plenty of folks who will tell you there's a really important block of people here. I'll give you an example. There's an Armenian American population in the Glendale area. A lot of them are very active in local government, very vibrant. It's reflected in a lot of things. There's like restaurants and social activities, cultural activities. It's there. Okay, and that's not a VRA protected community. You're not going to get a majority-minority district, but it certainly can be recognized as a community of interest. Okay. Warning, however, you are not supposed to use, or you'll get in trouble, and there's more to it than just being a predominant factor, but that will trigger a close analysis under federal constitutional law if you use race or ethnicity as the predominant factor. Okay. Now that doesn't mean the public can't say, here's an ethnic community. They can say whatever they want to and say, well, this is my community, and it's the Hmong community. The commission, however, has to say, well, okay, that's important. We should protect that. But yeah, there's an ethnic community here, but it's also one that's very similar economically. It's fairly well defined in terms of geography. There's a lot of other social institutions that are tied in with this particular set of people. Bring in a lot of other factors. Okay, Justin Levin used a very good metaphor, which is when you're driving a car, you don't just look at the speedometer. Right? You look. There's a whole bunch of other factors that you're supposed to pay attention to when you're looking at race or ethnicity. Don't just look at the speedometer. Okay, that's something the commission has to watch out for. Okay, so basic question: why do you have to worry about this? Okay, because you're not drawing the lines. You're picking people to draw the lines. Well, one is it's going to come up. You're going to read applications where they talk about communities of interest, either as something that's important or they are part of a community of interest. So, I've picked two of the commissioners. Maria Blanco, in her opening statement, talks about the importance of redistricting as a key to democracy. And it's important because in drawing lines that encompass communities of interest and maximize opportunities for representation, those communities are given a voice in government. Okay? And then Stan Forbes talks about the fact that districts ought to represent communities of interest, but a lot of this has been about partisanship. And those kinds of districts drawn for partisan purposes may not represent communities of interest or reflect common interests in solving the problems facing the state. Okay, so you're going to get that in a lot of places. General statements, indications of appreciation, other parts of the applications. Okay. I would suggest, and this is you have a tough job because you have to do so much of the screening based on paper, and a lot of the stuff, and I've had talked about sort of those between the lines and more people-oriented factors and characteristics that you want to look at, but you're not going to get, or it's very hard to get that in the paper process. So a lot of the stuff you'll have to get down to 120, and you'll have to go through the interview process. But you have to think about, well, how are they going to approach communities of interest? Because it is a big driver of the commission's strategies and its implementation of the public input process. So you have to be impartial. You have to look at how it fits into analytical skills. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer, but you want to have people be thinking about this because that's what they're going to have to do, and they have to reconcile some of those inconsistencies and some of those gaps. Okay. Okay. Some concluding suggestions. I'm happy to take questions and talk about other things and other areas too. If you want to talk about some of the analytical stuff or the impartiality points. But just to reiterate. Okay, you have to get down to 60 people, but no group of 60 people, let alone 14, is going to be fully representative of the diversity of the state. Try your best, cover as many bases as you can, watch out for disparities. If there's something you see in the stats, you got to figure out how to fix it. Hopefully you don't have to go back and reread applications, but that's why you want to keep looking at those numbers all the time. Here's an important point. No individual knows California so well that they won't have to listen and learn from the other commissioners, the staff, the consultants, and the public. Okay, if you get somebody who says, nobody knows California better than I do, one, they're wrong, because somebody will know California better than they do, and two, you don't want someone like that on a commission. Right? You want to have someone who's open-minded and is willing to listen and doesn't think they know everything already. Okay, because trust me, there's so much stuff that I didn't know about California. I learned a tremendous amount when I was a commissioner. I didn't know that the folks in the northwestern part of the state, they don't say Del Norte, they say Del Norte. Okay, I learned that almond farmers farm almonds sometimes, or Norco It's not a shopping mall. Norco's not a shopping mall. It's a city in Riverside County where Commissioner Filkins Weber is from, and there's hardly any sidewalks because it's a horse-focused community. It's an equestrian community, and it's Horsetown, USA. Okay, you learn a lot. So I didn't know that part of the Burbank Airport, the Bob Hope Airport, is in LA. Okay, one of the runways is in LA, and not that anybody lives at the airport, but you got to figure out where all these lines are drawn. So you learn a lot of different stuff, and nobody knows it that well to say, I'm really an expert on California. Okay, so you have to be open to learning, and there again, there are these somewhat less specific, a little more intangible characteristics that you have to look for. Are you open-minded? Are you team-oriented? Are you flexible? Are you patient? Are you eager to listen and learn? That's built into some of the formal criteria, but a lot of it is, what does it mean to be on any kind of governmental body? What does it mean to manage a staff, to work with consultants, to listen to a lot of people out in the public? Those are all things that are built into the criteria, but some of it is not necessarily on paper. Right? Andre Parvenu talked about the fact that this particular group of 14 got along really, really well together. I remember when and again, I was a replacement commissioner. They'd already met a lot before I came on, and we went out to dinner after a meeting, and I didn't realize these folks liked to party that much. Okay, not that it was it was a big raucous thing, but it was a very, very friendly, convivial, very social group of people. And that's not required. It's not in the law, right? And you don't necessarily have to have that dynamic to do good work. But this particular group of people is exceptionally talented and experienced, and they get along really well together, which is not always the case with a lot of, any kind of body, whether it's governmental or non-governmental, but I think we got lucky, too. But your work is to try to at least form the basis for that kind of really good dynamic. And hopefully you'll get a lot of good people in the process. Okay, I think that's all I have in terms of formal presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions from the panel? Mr. Belknap?
So thank you. I really appreciate your presentation. One of the questions that came up in my mind, and I'm hoping you can give me insight into it, is with the community of interest, obtaining the information on where those communities are and then defining where they are sounds time-consuming and difficult. So that's a hard-won data set. Versus city lines, county lines, is an easily won data set.
Yeah.
How do you, after obtaining this hard-won data set, then put them on equal footing in your analysis of where the district line should be?
Yeah, and that is a hard one because it would have been nice if they actually ranked it within. However they did it, if they actually ranked it within. But you're right, and obviously folks who like precision, and this is something to think about too, because you have to have a high tolerance for particularly in this area, for lack of precision and not having absolutely clear principles, right? So, you all have accounting backgrounds, right? So you have GAAP, right? Generally accepted accounting principles. There's no GARP, generally accepted redistricting principles. There's a lot of similar criteria. There's a lot of software that everybody uses, but and certainly, even within California, let alone the country, there's no right or wrong set of criteria. They're just there, and you adapt. So you're pointing out one of the biggest challenges, and I don't think we necessarily had a strategy going into it to say, well, if there's a conflict between city or county or between community of interest or neighborhood, and they just don't mesh how we put it together. My sense, and this is again, 8 years ago. I was thinking about it sort of nostalgically, but you can certainly look at the transcripts of meetings as well and some of the videos. I suspect that we had a back and forth, right? And that in a lot of cases, communities of interest, it wasn't as much of an issue because communities of interest tended to fall within the boundaries of, say, a city, and certainly a county, because counties are much larger. So those kind of conflicts didn't arise, but they came up occasionally. And the harder one is community of interest versus community of interest. And lots of testimony versus just a little bit of testimony. which is a big challenge because people mobilize, and that's part of democracy. People mobilize, and you get a high volume of people saying the same thing. Now, do you weight that more than this one individual comes in and says, well, here's my neighborhood, and here's my community, and it's only one person, but that might, in fact, be representative of that particular community. So that's another level of how do you reconcile the differences. I don't think we had a particular strategy to say, well, we will always look at cities versus counties. One thing I pushed for, and we did to some extent, was to try to look at official neighborhood boundaries within a lot of cities, but those can vary. Realtors have one way of looking at, cities have another way of looking at. There's no absolute way to define a neighborhood. So I'm not giving you a direct answer because I don't think there really was a specific and overarching strategy to try to reconcile them. We just worked through it, and again, I think the commission went out of its way to be consensus driven. And one thing we did do, which may or may not be a good thing to do next time around, is everybody went to all the hearings. Okay, I don't know that's the most efficient way to do it, but we did it, and not everybody attended each time, but we all tried to make it to all of the meetings and to listen, so we would all get hear the same thing and get the same picture. Not everybody read every written piece of testimony, so there was some delegation of some of those responsibilities. That's up to the commission, the next commission, to kind of figure some of that out. I don't know if they'll have more or less in terms of volume, but some of these problems are going to pop up. So again, kind of a long answer to your question, but there wasn't a really defined strategy to try to reconcile the difference. We just kind of worked through them as we were putting the lines together.
And I have a follow-up question, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
So how often in your deliberations did you have city officials or county board of supervisors, county officials, come and advocate for their lines for their cities and counties to remain intact?
Not too often. We had I remember we had one. I think he may have. I can't remember if he was actually a city council member or already a county. Well, anyway, he was in San Jose. It was George Shirakawa, who unfortunately had a bit of problems with criminal activity later. But in any case, I remember he came to one of our meetings and talked about particular neighborhoods that he represented within his particular district, because San Jose has districts. Not too many, really. His sort of sticks out in my mind. But as you mentioned before, they are defined, right? So I suspect it is when there are contradictions or conflicts where someone or a group of people come in and say, here's the community, it straddles a couple cities, so protect that rather than the city boundaries. And again, I don't remember exact examples of when that might have occurred, but they did pop up occasionally. Yeah.
Did you have a question, Mr. Coe?
I did have a question, kind of similar to Mr. Belknap's question. Is it once you've gone through the process of, I guess, getting some type of consensus definition of what the communities of interest are, and we've taken into account all of the input, and in those scenarios where you found that they overlapped each other, how did you guys approach drawing the lines in the interests, or when communities of interest overlapped with each other once those definitions had kind of been defined?
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, we probably made mistakes. Okay, I'll be the first to admit we made a lot of mistakes, particularly early in the process, and I think we fixed a lot of them as we got through the process. But I'll defend all that we did. We had discussions. We worked through them. Often we looked at other elements, either higher criteria where there might be a question, because a lot of the stuff does overlap. So you're talking about, say, a majority-minority district that's adjacent to a population where there's, let's say, a high concentration of Latinos and Asians in southern LA County, northern Orange County, where we had a lot of VRA-focused districts, but there were other populations. So how do we kind of reconcile some of those? Again, I don't think we had a particular approach and a clear rule that was always applied across the board. I think we talked about it, we worked it through, we looked at other elements. Even though there might be the criteria are lower ranked, it's something you could think about to say, well, if it might be more compact if we do it this way. Other things being equal, okay, that's not necessarily making compactness more important than communities of interest, but it is a way of kind of figuring out how to break a tie. Okay, what else can we look at? You know, if we're drawing a Senate district here and a congressional district here, should we maybe try to line those up? Just because there may be administrative advantages to doing that. So those kinds of factors kind of come into play. And again, these are, you have to make judgment calls a lot of times, right? So it's not, and this is we always went back to the criteria to say, well, this is why we're doing this. But you're right, there are a lot of places where there are not clear rules and there are ambiguities, and you just make judgments about what you think ought to be the right way to draw the lines. Now, again, and having said that, the next commission might say, we need rules. We need a set of regulations. And that's up to them to figure that out. And if people talk about that in their applications or in the interview process, it might be a great way to approach it. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that's a different way to look at it. But we didn't do as, and I think if we'd had more time, if we had a better sense of the volume before it came in, we would have developed a stronger infrastructure. We didn't have that advantage. In hindsight, and looking forward for the next commission, you need a really solid infrastructure to take in that information, process it. You know, if you ask me to put the communities of interest on a map, an overall map, can't do it. I'm not sure if our consultants could have done that, but that might be something you want to strive for. 'Cause at least you can say, well, there they are, right? And here's where there are conflicts, and let's just figure out how we're going to figure this one out. We didn't do that, and we were really tight on time. They have more time this round. They'll have several months more to kind of get a lot of their agency infrastructure and preparatory work and data collection. Outside of the testimony, that'll come ahead, and you can do it ahead of the census data coming out too.
Actually, you answered my question with that, so. Did you have another question? Mr. Coe?
I had one further question. You mentioned kind of the dangers of manipulation, in terms of partisan interests in your hearings that you had when you were getting public testimony. How did the commission kind of attempt to avoid that type of manipulation?
Yeah. Well, you can't avoid it if you have an open mic. Okay, it just comes in, and you get it in oral testimony. You'll get maps, you'll get reports. You know, a lot of folks just talk about one place where they live, and this is, you ought to keep this together. Plenty of folks give you full-blown maps. Okay, a lot of organizations will give you 4 sets, fully drawn state of California. Okay, it varies quite a bit, and it's all important, right? So, you know, it becomes sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not so obvious. You do a Google search on organization X, which is submitting you a map, and going, who are these people, right? Now, a lot of folks form coalitions just for the purpose of redistricting, which is not to say folks don't in fact represent particular organizational or group interests that are perfectly legitimate and have every right to participate in the process. Honestly, right? Others, you go, well, I'm not sure who this is, right? I think this might be and you start looking at it and go, I think this might be more, they're kind of leaning Republican here, I think that's what's going on here. So, which is not to say you discount the map, but you think, well, maybe this is drawn for partisan purposes, and let's look at, there might be some useful information there, but it's important to look at what you can look at and what you can't look at, right? Now, in some other instances, it gets kind of obvious because things kind of creep in where you hear, well, one of our interests has to revolve around the fact that we like our representative. Okay, well, if you like your representative who's an incumbent, well, and that's your interest, well, that's not something we can really look at because that's an incumbent, right? That's prohibited. Now, you may in fact have a lot in common with each other, and we can look at other stuff, and you've probably pointed out something that's important because there's an existing district where there's a lot of commonalities within that district, and there's maybe perfectly good reasons and independent reasons to maintain similar lines, not the exact same lines. But that came out. And it got some of our hearings got a little messy, a little boisterous, loud. We had to have police come in occasionally. It's not necessarily any different from, if you go to a school board hearing or something controversial or city, you get some loud people. So this is, the commission wasn't immune from that. And this was a time when, Tea Party activism was, growing quite a bit. So we had a lot of folks, and they spoke and they gave their opinions. And I think we recognize a lot of those interests in terms of how the lines were drawn. But got kind of loud. Okay, so you have to kind of measure that. Again, you don't want to go in there saying, well, we need to test the sincerity of every written testimony. You have to look at it carefully and think, well, yeah, this seems, and again, I think the presumption is that it is in good faith, that it is sincere, but it comes up. And one of the, I don't know if this has actually been talked about, but I think Andre Parvin brought this up a little bit in terms of the context of people being honest. One of the concerns that a lot of us on the commission have talked about is the fact that because of the, how you look at eligibility and the number of years between, say, changing parties and how you move forward, you, as a panel and your staff and your investigators, need to look really carefully at people's backgrounds, okay? Because, you might have been a really strong partisan at some point, 10 years back, but you knew how this process was going to work and you turned into a no-party preference, and maybe you're not really what you say you are, or there's something that might creep in. Now, again, I'm not trying to suggest that there is insincerity or dishonesty that you'll encounter, but you might get that, and that's something that a lot of commissioners have been concerned about in our own discussions, that it could be tainted. And this is your process, not necessarily the commission's process itself, but that's something, I'm sure you've been thinking about it, and your council's been thinking about that as well. It's just something you have to, and you're auditors, right? That's part of your job, is to kind of look deeply at where there might be inconsistencies or problems. So that's why you're doing this job. But yeah, it becomes obvious in a lot of cases. It's not so obvious in other cases, but ultimately, you got to feel comfortable with this is what we got, and these are the lines we drew. And I don't think there's any we had one commissioner who dissented on the maps and one who voted against congressional maps, but it wasn't unanimous. But I think if you talk to the commissioners, at least supported the maps that we drew, that we think we got it right. It wasn't perfect, but we are confident that we drew maps that complied with the law and took into account important considerations like public testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any more questions? No more questions? Thank you. I want to thank you for your presentation.
Okay. Let me mention one thing just as a closing, because we've been getting kind of nostalgic over the last couple of months, and we're ending our terms next July. I just want to say this was a real thrill being a commissioner, because if folks are listening, it was an enormous undertaking. I think we're all proud of our work. I had a lot of fun doing it. I can't speak for all the commissioners, but if you ask me what's your biggest single accomplishment in your professional life, this is it. I know at least a couple people who will share that sentiment. I'm really proud of all the work I did before I became on the commission. I'm proud of the work I've done since. This does not count family and all the things that are really important. But this was a life-changing experience for many, if not most of us. Except for Vince, who's he's in a whole other level of government and just, corporate success. But for the rest of us, I think, I don't know if we can top it, frankly, in terms of things we've done, things we'll do. But it has been an absolute joy, and this is a great bunch of people to have worked with. And I think, which is why I think your task is so important, that at least you come up with 60 people who really will be good representatives for the state of California. Okay.
Thank you very much.
So thank you.